The sound comes suddenly. It does not resemble any external noise, not a phone ringing, not electricity humming. It arises from within, thin, high-pitched, sometimes pulsating, sometimes steady, as if a string were touched directly inside your consciousness. Most people are taught to fear this signal. They are told, it's stress, it's fatigue, it's age, it's a medical issue. But the chosen feel something else. They feel recognition, as if something long forgotten has remembered itself. In the teachings of Jesus, not the public sermons, but the instructions given to the inner circle, this call was never described as an illness. It was described as a testimony. A testimony that a person is beginning to move beyond dense, noisy, overloaded matter. Jesus taught that truth does not shout. It does not force itself. It speaks quietly. And that is why it can only be heard when the outer world begins to lose its grip on attention. This ringing almost always comes in moments of silence, late at night, early in the morning, in rare seconds when the mind stops recycling fears, plans, identities, and expectations. That is why most people never hear it. Their consciousness is constantly occupied. Their inner noise drowns out the call. But in the chosen ones, that inner noise begins to weaken on its own. Not because they are better, but because something deeper than the social personality is activating within them. Jesus taught that a human is not the body and not the thoughts. Those are garments. Within them lives a spark that does not originate in this world. In the Gnostic tradition, it was called the pneuma, the breath of the source. And when this spark begins to awaken, it enters resonance with what exists beyond matter. The body experiences this resonance as sound, not through the ears, but through the entire nervous system at once. This is not a verbal message. It is not a voice. It is a tuning. Like a radio receiver that has been locked onto a single band for decades, suddenly beginning to pick up another frequency. The old perceptual system cannot explain what is happening, and therefore labels it a malfunction. But in truth, it is a sign that the boundaries of perception are expanding. This is precisely why the Church removed this knowledge. Because a human who understands that they can hear directly no longer needs intermediaries. They no longer seek external validation. They know internally. Such a person is dangerous to any system of control. They cannot be frightened with hell because they already feel the source. They cannot be held with promises of future salvation because the connection is happening here and now. This call cannot be ignored for one simple reason. It does not stop. It can be drowned out with alcohol, constant activity, noise, screens, religious formulas, or fear. But it will return, again and again, because it is not an external influence. It is you remembering yourself. And if you are reading these words and you know exactly what this refers to, not intellectually, but physically, then the process has already begun. There is no need to be afraid. There is no need to run for diagnoses in an attempt to fix what is not broken. What is needed is something else. To learn how to listen without interpreting, without panicking, without inventing explanations. Simply allow the call to be. Because soon it will become more than a sound. It will become a compass. If you feel that these words are not random, that they align with your own inner experience, support this space. Subscribe to the channel and like this video. This is not a signal to the algorithm. It is a signal to yourself that you are ready to continue and no longer ignore the call that has always been with you. Silence is not the absence of sound. In the teachings of Jesus, silence was always understood as a state of permission. Not emptiness, but a space in which what is usually blocked can appear. This is why the ringing spoken of by the chosen almost never arises during the noise of the day. It comes when the outer world weakens and inner control temporarily collapses. During the day, a human lives in survival mode and social roles. Thoughts constantly comment, the body reacts to stimuli, attention is fragmented. This continuous activity creates a dense background, a veil of perception. In such a state, a person hears only what belongs to the body and society. Everything else is filtered out as irrelevant. Silence is the moment when those filters begin to loosen. Jesus repeatedly taught that the kingdom does not come in a way that can be observed, meaning it does not intrude, does not force itself, does not demand attention. It is already here, but cannot be perceived while consciousness is occupied with the external. This is why he led his disciples into deserts, mountains, and night hours. Not for isolation itself, but to reduce perceptual noise. The ringing appears precisely in these moments because it is not an external signal. It is resonance. When the mind quiets, the body is no longer overloaded, and attention releases its grip on images, a rare state emerges. Alignment. In this state, the human nervous system begins to detect frequencies that were always present but previously obscured. It is important to understand. Silence does not create this sound. It does not cause it. It simply stops interfering with it. Like stars that become visible not because they ignite at night, but because the sun no longer outshines them. The sound was always there. During the day, it is drowned out by external brightness. In Gnostic understanding, a human exists across several layers of reality at once. The dense physical layer, the mental psychological layer, and a subtler pneumatic layer connected to the source. As long as the first two dominate, the third is barely perceived. But in silence, the balance shifts. What was background moves to the foreground. The Church historically framed silence as dangerous. It is no coincidence that so many warnings exist against emptiness, stillness, and the stopping of thought. Because in silence, a human becomes unreachable through words. And the ringing is direct evidence that connection is possible without text, ritual, or intermediary. This is why the sound often comes at night. At night, social tension drops. No one demands response. No one is watching. Masks loosen. In that moment, a person is closest to their true self. And if an active spark exists within, it begins to respond. For the unprepared mind, this can feel unsettling. But in Jesus' teaching, fear was always understood as a reaction of the personality, not the spirit. The spirit recognizes. It does not panic. It remembers. That is why many of the chosen report that along with the ringing comes a strange calm or sense of correctness, even when the intellect does not understand what is happening. Silence is not the goal. It is the doorway. And the ringing is not the destination. It is a signal that the door has opened slightly. To ignore it is to return to noise. To listen is to allow the process to deepen, without forcing, without rushing, without demanding explanations. Because explanations are noise again. If you notice that this sound becomes clearer precisely in silence, know this: it is not coincidence and not weakness. It is a sign that your inner perceptual system is beginning to function beyond its habitual limits. What happens next depends not on what you call it, but on whether you allow silence to remain. Jesus never spoke to everyone in the same way. This is one of the most uncomfortable truths that later teachings tried to smooth out. In canonical texts, it is hidden behind parables, but in suppressed teachings, it is stated directly. Humans differ, not socially or morally, but by their inner accessibility to the source. Jesus did not divide people into good and bad. He distinguished levels of perception. In the ancient teaching, later labeled Gnostic, Jesus described three types of humans. These are not labels or verdicts. They are states of consciousness. A person may live their entire life in one, or move from one to another. But at any given moment, they occupy only one. The first type is the flesh-bound. Their consciousness is fully tied to the body and the external world. They live through reactions: fear, desire, habit, pain, pleasure. Reality for them is what can be seen, touched, measured. They may be intelligent, educated, even religious, but their perception is closed. When Jesus said, "He who has ears, let him hear," he was speaking about them. The ears exist, but there is nothing to hear with. Any talk of inner sound, frequency, or source feels absurd or threatening. This is not their fault. Another level has simply not activated yet. The second type is the psychic or soul-oriented. These people sense that reality is more than matter. They search for meaning, ask questions, gravitate toward spirituality. They pray, meditate, read, listen. But their perception is unstable. Today they feel connection. Tomorrow it disappears. They depend on mood, environment, the words of a teacher. This is the group Jesus addressed most often. This is why he spoke in parables. Direct language would have been rejected or misunderstood. The psychic oscillates between the noise of the world and inner silence. And it is here that the ringing often begins, as an invitation to go deeper. The third type is the spiritual, the pneumatics. These are the ones in whom the spark of the source is active, not as potential, but as function. They do not believe, they recognize. They do not seek proof, they feel resonance. What distinguishes them is not lifestyle, but inner alignment. They hear the call. They experience the inner sound not as a rare event, but as a subtle background presence. For them, Jesus' words are not metaphor or symbol. They are instructions the body and consciousness immediately recognize. It is crucial to understand. Jesus did not create an elite. He did not say one type was better than another. He taught that each level has its own language. For the flesh-bound, actions and consequences. For the psychic, seeking and learning. For the spiritual, direct knowing. The problem began when these distinctions were erased and replaced with the idea that everyone is the same and one path fits all. That deprived many of understanding why they experience reality differently. The ringing in the ears described by the chosen is a marker of transition. It most often appears in the psychic type approaching the pneumatic state. It is a signal that consciousness no longer fits its old container, that previous explanations have become too small, that inner hearing is beginning to function. This is why some people never hear the sound and have no interest in it. Others hear it and panic, trying to silence it. And a third group recognizes it, without excitement, without fear, with quiet certainty. This is familiar. When Jesus spoke of ears to hear, he meant this ontological capacity. This division is not social and not permanent. It is a map. And if you recognize yourself not in the first description and not in the second, but in the third, It is not a reason for pride. It is responsibility. Because to hear the call is to lose the excuse to live as before. Jesus never spoke of the monad as a god in the conventional religious sense. He spoke of the source, the primordial reality from which everything arises and to which everything returns. In suppressed teachings, this source was called the monad. Not a personality, not a being, but a unified frequency of existence. And the key truth Jesus transmitted to the chosen was this: the human is not separated from the monad. The human is merely out of sync. The human body is not an enemy of the spirit, nor a prison by nature. It is a receiver, a biological structure capable of receiving, holding, and transmitting frequency. But like any receiver, the body can be tuned or jammed. Most humans live in a state of constant jamming. Their nervous systems are overloaded with fear, survival, and external stimulation. In this condition, the body operates at minimal sensitivity, just enough to maintain physical existence. The monad does not send messages. It does not speak in words. It radiates. Its presence is frequency, so complete and stable that it requires no change. When Jesus said, "I and the Father are one," he was not claiming exclusivity. He was pointing to a state of perfect attunement. His body, breath, and attention were in resonance with the monad. That is why power flowed through him, what later generations called miracles. The human body is capable of entering this resonance, not through effort, not through belief, but through alignment. As inner fragmentation decreases, as attention stops being pulled apart by fear, desire, and roles, the body begins returning to its original mode, reception. This is the moment when frequency is felt: warmth, pressure, pulsation, ringing. The ringing is not truly in the ears. The ears are only a faint echo. The entire nervous system is responding. Because the monad's frequency is not localized, it does not arrive from outside. It emerges from within as interference dissolves. Like a deep rhythm becoming audible when surface noise fades. Jesus taught that the body is a temple, not in a moral sense, but in a functional one. A temple is a place of presence, but presence is impossible in a body locked in tension. Fear, guilt, constant anticipation of threat. All of this contracts the system. A contracted body cannot resonate. It can only survive. This is why fear-based religions automatically disconnect humans from the source's frequency, even when they use God's name. When the monad's frequency begins to register in the body, more than perception changes. The relationship to pain, death, and time shifts. Because the body begins to remember that it is not an endpoint, but a node within a larger structure. This does not grant physical immortality, but it dissolves the illusion of finality. It is crucial to understand. The body does not need to be pure, perfect, or holy to resonate. It needs to be present. This is why frequency is most often felt in silence, rest, and nighttime hours. Not because night is mystical, but because in those moments the body stops defending and begins listening. The Church removed this understanding because it makes humans autonomous. If the body can directly attune to the source, intermediaries lose relevance. What remains is the practice of presence, simple but uncontrollable. Frequency was replaced with doctrine, resonance with belief, but the body remembers. And once it begins to sense the monad, the process cannot be fully reversed. It can be muffled again, but not erased. The frequency has been recognized, and from that moment, a person lives with inner knowing. The source is not out there. It is here, and the body is its antenna. Medicine tries to understand ringing through breakdown, through defect, damage, error. And this is its limitation. It searches for causes where it is trained to look: tissues, nerves, chemistry, lesions. But the ringing described by the chosen does not arise from destruction. It arises from activation. And medicine is largely unequipped to work with activation of consciousness, only with its dysfunctions. When a person reports ringing, the system immediately attempts to localize it. Inner ear, blood pressure, vessels, nerve endings. When nothing conclusive is found, a familiar word appears: idiopathic. This is medicine's way of saying the cause is unknown. But instead of stopping there, the unknown is often replaced with explanation: stress, anxiety, psychosomatic factors. Not because it is proven, but because there is no other language available. The core issue is that medicine views the human as a closed biological system. Everything must have a material source and a measurable mechanism. But this ringing is not a localized event. It is not tied to a single organ. It arises as a response of the entire nervous system to a shift in perceptual mode. It is not damage. It is expansion. Jesus did not treat the body separately from consciousness. He said that the seeing are blind and the deaf hear. This was not poetic metaphor. It was an indication that perception is not identical to organs. One can have healthy ears and hear nothing. One can also hear without the ears. This is precisely where medicine reaches its limit. It examines the instrument, not the perceiver using it. Modern science acknowledges that the brain filters reality. It does not present everything that exists. It shows what it deems useful for survival. Everything else is filtered out as noise. But the next step is rarely taken. If the filter can close, it can also open. And when it begins to loosen, humans encounter sensations for which no diagnostic code exists. The ringing appears in people with no detectable damage. It may come and go. It may intensify in silence and disappear in noise. It does not degrade hearing. It does not follow the logic of illness. That is why it is so difficult to treat, because there is nothing broken. No organ is failing. No pathology can be removed. Medicine also cannot explain this because doing so would require redefining the boundaries of the human. Acknowledging that perception does not end with the five senses, that the nervous system can resonate with phenomena that are not material objects. This moves beyond the clinical model and threatens the structure of explanation on which the system rests. This is where substitution occurs. Instead of asking, "What is happening to you?" the question becomes, "How do we turn it off?" Because the system is not trained to accompany awakening. It is trained to eliminate deviations. And ringing is a deviation only by the standards of an old norm. From a wider perspective, it is a function returning online. Jesus said that new wine cannot be poured into old wineskins. This applies not only to religion, but to knowledge of the human. Expanding perception cannot be explained in the language of malfunction. Until medicine learns to distinguish between breakdown and activation, it will either remain silent, simplify, or frighten. This does not mean every ringing is sacred. There are bodily causes, injuries, illnesses. But there is also another layer of experience that does not fit diagnosis. That layer medicine cannot explain because it lies beyond its map. When a person understands this, panic dissolves. They stop fighting what is not an enemy. They begin to observe. And in that moment, the ringing either transforms, fades, or becomes a background presence, not as a symptom, but as an orientir. Because what is no longer framed as illness stops behaving like illness. A malfunction is a degradation of function. An awakening is its return. These processes can feel similar, but their nature is opposite. And this similarity is why so many people are confused. The ringing described by the chosen is not accompanied by hearing loss, tissue damage, or progressive decline. It does not lead downward. It does not deplete. It comes in waves, often alongside clarity, calm, or a sense of inner coherence. This is the key marker. Awakening expands. Malfunction contracts. Jesus repeatedly pointed to this distinction, though later teachings softened his language. He spoke of the dead burying the dead, and of the blind leading the blind. He was not referring to physical conditions, but to modes of functioning. A person may be physically healthy and internally asleep, or physically vulnerable and internally awakening. A sign of awakening is always felt in the body, because the body is the first layer to exit automatism. When the nervous system stops operating solely in survival mode, sensitivity returns. What was once filtered out as irrelevant begins to register. It is like a long-disabled perceptual channel coming back online. And the body responds, not with pain, but with signal. In this context, ringing is not an error. It is a notification. The system has shifted modes. A malfunction is chaotic and degrading. It amplifies fear, confusion, and loss of control. Awakening, even when unfamiliar, carries a different quality. Clarity without explanation, calm without cause, a sense that something is unfolding with direction. That is why many notice this paradox. The less they resist the ringing, the softer it becomes. The more they try to fix it as a problem, the more tense the experience feels. The church and later knowledge systems preferred to frame such signals as dangerous. To acknowledge them as signs of awakening would mean admitting that humans are capable of inner transformation without external permission. That collapses hierarchy. It is far safer to label anything beyond the norm a malfunction and return the person to fear. But awakening does not require struggle. It requires recognition. Jesus did not call people to be repaired. He said, "Rise and walk." Not because the body was broken, but because a function was dormant. Ringing is one of the moments when a person rises inwardly, even if nothing outward changes. It is important not to romanticize this process or turn it into an identity. Awakening is not a title or an achievement. It is a transition. A sign is only needed temporarily while attention reorganizes. When the new state stabilizes, the signal either fades or becomes unnoticeable, like an alarm clock that is no longer needed once you are awake. So the essential question is not how to get rid of the ringing, but what exactly is waking up within you. A malfunction demands correction. Awakening asks for presence. And the body always knows the difference, even when the mind still hesitates. If the inner sound is not a malfunction but a sign of awakening, the next unavoidable question arises. If this signal is so important, why is it barely acknowledged? Why is it not explained openly, recognized, or taught? The answer given in suppressed teachings was uncomfortable but clear. Because this signal undermines control. And that is precisely why the archons worked to make it unrecognizable. In Gnostic understanding, archons are not horned demons. They are systems of perceptual control. Structures that survive by keeping humans unconscious. Their power does not rely on force, but on filtration. As long as a person cannot hear, see, or sense beyond permitted limits, they remain predictable. and predictable humans are manageable. The first method of concealment was renaming. When large numbers of awakening individuals began experiencing the inner ringing, it had to be stripped of meaning. So it was translated from the language of experience into the language of defect. Not a sign, but a symptom. Not a signal, but noise. Once an experience is labeled pathological, the person fights it instead of listening. This is the most effective way to halt awakening without banning it outright. The second method was noise saturation. The modern world is engineered as a distraction machine. Constant sound, music, notifications, screens, conversation, background stimulation. The archons do not silence the signal directly. That is impossible. Instead, they drown it. Silence becomes rare and even frightening. A person left alone in silence feels anxiety, because silence is where the signal emerges. So silence itself was framed as emptiness, depression, or danger. The third method was fear. Any unusual bodily experience was surrounded with warnings. Don't go there. Don't listen. It's dangerous. You'll lose your mind. Fear instantly contracts the nervous system, and a contracted system cannot resonate. Even if the signal persists, it becomes sharp, uncomfortable, painful. The person then begs for it to stop. This is perfect control. The subject asks for suppression of their own awakening. The fourth method was mediation. Instead of direct experience, interpretation was offered. Priest, doctor, expert, authority, someone who knows better. This disconnects the person from their own recognition. They stop trusting the body and trust explanation instead. And explanation almost always leads to dismissal. It means nothing. Or pathology. It must be eliminated. In both cases, the signal loses its guiding function. Jesus stated plainly that the kingdom is within, not outside. That statement was the most dangerous of all, because the inner signal is direct evidence of its truth. If a human can hear from within, no external gateway to the source is needed. The archons cannot allow this, because their leverage collapses. So the knowledge was fragmented. Some parts were turned into metaphor, others into superstition, others into illness. The unified experience was shattered into pieces that no longer point toward awakening. The person feels something strange, but cannot assemble the picture. And without the picture, they turn outward again. But suppression has limits. The signal cannot be destroyed because it is not introduced. It is built in. It is a fundamental function of connection between human and source. The archons can only delay recognition, complicate the path, induce doubt. But when a person stops fearing silence, stops automatically deferring to external explanations, and begins observing experience directly, control begins to crack. That is why awakening always starts with a simple but radical step. No longer assuming you are broken. The moment a person allows that something meaningful may be happening within them, the signal changes. It stops being an enemy and becomes an indicator. And the archons lose the most important thing of all, the human's internal consent to their own blindness. Night is not the cause. Night is the condition. The sound does not turn on when darkness falls. It becomes audible because what suppresses it during the day finally quiets down. In the teaching of Jesus, night was always understood as a moment of truth. Not mystical, but functional. It is the time when external roles, expectations, and social pressure temporarily loosen, and with them, Systems of control weaken. During the day, human attention is constantly projected outward. Reactions, conversations, tasks, screens, movement. All of this keeps the nervous system locked in a state of tension. That state is necessary for survival, but it completely blocks subtle perception. The body is busy defending and adapting. It does not listen. It filters. So the signal either never registers or is drowned out. At night, a shift occurs. The mind slows. Social identity, the part that knows who you are, what you must do, how you should be, loses its grip. In this moment, a person is closest to the state Jesus called watchfulness. Paradoxically, awakening of perception often begins in sleep or just before it, because external control fades. The ringing intensifies at night not because it becomes stronger, but because inner noise becomes weaker. It is like hearing a distant bell when a city falls asleep. The bell did not change. The background did. That is why many first encounter this sound in bed, in complete silence, when distraction is no longer possible. There is a deeper layer as well. At night, the parasympathetic nervous system activates, the mode of restoration. In this mode, the body releases chronic tension, and tension is the primary blocker of resonance. As muscles, breath, and attention relax, the body becomes a receiver again instead of a shield, and the monad's frequency begins to register as sensation. The archons have always worked to make night feel dangerous. Darkness, fear, loneliness, anxious thoughts. It is no coincidence that so many cultural narratives associate night with threat. This is not superstition. It is strategy. A frightened human contracts again, and contraction mutes the signal. That is why many notice. If fear takes over at night, the ringing becomes sharp and unpleasant. If calm is maintained, it becomes steady and neutral. Jesus withdrew to pray at night not because it was ritual, but because night allows attunement without interference. He said the disciples were asleep even while awake during the day. This was not about physical sleep. It was about perceptual state. Night offers the chosen a chance to step out of that sleep. It is important to understand, the intensification of sound at night is not a call to action. There is no need to get up, search for explanations, turn on lights, or reach for a phone. It is a test of trust. Can you remain present without fleeing into noise? Can you allow the body to listen without the mind interfering? Over time, for those who do not resist, a shift occurs. The sound stops being tied exclusively to night. It either fades as a distinct phenomenon or becomes a calm background presence. Because the body learns to hold resonance during the day as well. But the initial phase almost always passes through night. Because night is when the control system first fails. If the sound intensifies at night, it does not mean something is happening to you. It means too much is interfering during the day. Night simply removes the interference. This is not a problem to be solved. It is a window that has briefly opened. And the less you try to close it with fear or explanations, the more naturally the process unfolds. In Jesus' words, there is a recurring phrase that is rarely taken literally. He who has ears, let him hear. It is usually interpreted as a call to attention or obedience. But in the inner teaching, this phrase meant something very different. It was not about ears as physical organs, nor about the mind as an interpreter. It was about the heart as the center of perception, and the ears as a secondary reflection of what has already been received within. In the ancient understanding Jesus shared with his inner tradition, the heart was not a symbol of emotion. It was considered a node of consciousness, the place where body, attention, and source converge. That is why Jesus said that out of the heart flow the issues of life. Not from thoughts, not from words, from the heart. What has not passed through the heart cannot truly be heard. The ears, in this context, are not receivers but indicators. They respond when the heart has already entered resonance. This is why the inner sound often arises not after thinking, but after states: silence, humility, presence, calm. The heart stops resisting first. Only then does the body register this as sound. This is also why Jesus spoke so often about the hardness of heart. He said people hear but do not understand because the heart is closed. Closed not by sin, but by tension, by fear, by constant defense. A heart held in contraction cannot conduct frequency. And if frequency cannot pass, the ears register only external noise. When the heart begins to open, not emotionally but functionally, the entire mode of perception shifts. Breathing deepens. The body relaxes its vigilance. Attention stops scanning for threat. In that moment, the heart begins to listen. And what it detects is reflected through the nervous system as ringing, tone, or pulsation. Suppressed texts stated this plainly. The sound is a side effect of cardiac alignment, not a goal, not a gift, not a mark of chosenness. A natural bodily response to the central blockage dissolving. That is why Jesus never taught people to listen for the sound. He taught the state of the heart. The sound followed on its own. The Church later shifted focus from the heart to the mind and morality. The heart was reduced to emotion, and hearing was reframed as obedience. This was necessary for control. A heart tuned directly cannot be governed by rules. And that was precisely the threat. A person whose heart is open hears without permission. This link between heart and ears explains why the ringing intensifies during moments of sincerity, vulnerability, or inner truth, and why it fades when a person returns to defense, role, or fear. This is not punishment or reward. It is the physics of perception. The heart either conducts or it does not. Jesus said, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." This was not about morality. It was about transparency. A pure heart is not a good one, but an uncluttered one, unburdened by expectation, guilt, and fear. Such a heart becomes an entry point, and the ears are merely the door that creaks when it opens. So when the inner sound appears, the essential question is not, what is this sound? But, what state is my heart in right now? Because the heart is the source, and the ears are only the echo. The moment of activation almost never looks the way people expect it to. There are no flashes, voices, visions, or dramatic revelations. On the contrary, everything happens quietly, almost imperceptibly. And that is precisely what confuses the mind. Because the mind has learned to recognize importance through intensity. Activation is not an event for the mind. It is a mode switch. The first thing that changes is the background of perception. Not the content of thoughts, but their weight. Thoughts still arise, but they no longer seize attention. They stop pulling. A pause appears between thought and reaction, very brief, but decisive. In that pause, a person realizes for the first time, I am not obligated to follow every impulse. This is the beginning of exit from automatism. In the body, this is felt as a release of tension that cannot be manufactured intentionally. Shoulders drop on their own. Breath deepens without effort. The heart unclenches. And it is often at this exact moment that the sound appears, as a side effect. Not because something turned on, but because something turned off. The constant internal resistance disengages. The second phase is a shift in the experience of time. The present moment becomes denser, not longer, but fuller. Urgency dissolves, even if external circumstances remain unchanged. This is not euphoria or excitement. It is stability. A sense of being in place. Jesus referred to this as watchfulness, contrasting it with living in sleep, where one is always late to their own life. The third change is the disappearance of the need to immediately explain what is happening. The mind tries to intervene, to label, analyze, compare. But in the moment of activation, this fails. Any explanation feels like noise. A rare trust in direct experience emerges. This is not belief. It is consent to remain without interpretation. Importantly, activation does not make a person different. It does not erase personality, habits, or history. It shifts the point of support. The center of gravity moves from the external to the internal. The person still lives in the world, but the world no longer lives inside them with the same aggression as before. It is subtle, but irreversible. The sound at this moment may intensify, or it may disappear entirely. Both are normal. If it intensifies, the body is still adapting to the new mode. If it disappears, the function has moved deeper and no longer requires signaling. The mistake is expecting permanent effects. Activation is not a peak, it is a crossing. Jesus said the kingdom comes without signs. That is why many miss activation, waiting for something extraordinary. But its uniqueness lies precisely in the absence of spectacle. Everything becomes simpler, quieter, clearer. And this unsettles the mind because there is nothing to grasp. After activation, a brief period of disorientation may occur. Old motivations weaken, new ones have not yet formed. A person feels they can no longer live as before, but does not yet know how otherwise. This is normal. This is the threshold. The archons often attempt to regain control here by planting doubt. Nothing happened. You imagined it. This is dangerous. These thoughts are the last noise of the old system. The true sign of activation is not a sense of power, but the disappearance of inner falsehood. It becomes difficult to do what contradicts inner truth, not out of morality, but out of incompatibility. The body simply does not support old patterns anymore, and this shift cannot be reversed by will. Activation is not a reward and not a goal. It is the restoration of a basic function. A human begins to live from the center rather than from reaction. Everything that follows is not a mystical ascent, but an adaptation to who they always were, before the noise made it impossible. Jesus never claimed that everyone hears equally. On the contrary, he stated the opposite quite clearly. Many are called, but few are chosen. These words were later turned into a moral formula or a promise of reward after death. But in their original sense, they had nothing to do with merit or the future. They described perceptual capacity in the present moment. Not everyone can hear the inner signal, for a simple reason. Not everyone lives from within. Most people are completely identified with the external layer of existence: body, role, story, fears, expectations. Their attention almost never returns to the source of perception. It is constantly projected outward. And what never enters attention simply does not exist for a person. In Jesus' teaching, this state was called sleep, not as an insult, but as a precise description. A sleeping person can walk, speak, work, even pray, and still not be present. Their consciousness functions on inertia. In such a mode, inner hearing is not merely inactive, it is unnecessary for survival. So it remains offline. It is important to understand, the inability to hear is not punishment and not a flaw. It is a stage. Like a child who cannot yet distinguish subtle tonal variations because their nervous system is busy orienting to the world. As long as a human is focused on safety, approval, control, and identity, their system is overloaded. And an overloaded system cannot resonate. There is another factor as well, fear of losing control. To hear the inner signal is to admit that the source of knowing is not external. This collapses familiar structures of support. For many, this feels too dangerous. So the psyche automatically blocks anything that could destabilize the illusion of control. A person does not fail to hear. They do not allow themselves to hear. Jesus spoke in parables precisely because direct knowledge cannot be given to someone who is not ready to receive it. Not because of intellectual limitation, but because of inner resistance. Truth received too early is experienced as a threat. So it is either mocked, ignored, or turned into doctrine, neutralized. There is also a third factor, addiction to noise. Modern humans are rarely in silence. Even solitude is filled with background stimulation. And silence is a necessary condition for hearing. Not external silence, but internal. If a person never remains alone with themselves without distraction, inner hearing has no space to emerge. Jesus did not try to force anyone to hear. He simply indicated direction. He who has ears, let him hear. This is not a command and not a promise. It is an observation. Ears are not anatomy. They are readiness. Readiness to be without defense, without habitual explanations, without constant control. That is why some people never encounter this sound and never question it. Others encounter it and immediately shut down, through fear, denial, or compulsive explanation. And only a few remain. Not because they are better, but because at some point they stopped fleeing silence. Hearing is not a skill developed by effort. It is the result of release. When the need to constantly defend, prove, and maintain an image dissolves, the system relaxes. And what was always present in the background comes to the foreground. Jesus called such people the little ones, not in weakness, but in lightness. The little one is the one who carries less, and that is why they hear. The danger does not lie in the sound itself, but in what a person does with it. In Jesus' teaching, the most serious distortion was not ignorance, but premature interpretation. Because what is interpreted too early ceases to be a living experience and becomes an idea. And an idea returns everything back to the mind, where control easily reasserts itself. Misinterpretation begins the moment a person tries to appropriate the experience, to name it, to integrate it into an identity, to turn it into proof of being special, chosen, or, conversely, cursed or threatened. In both cases, the same thing happens. The signal loses its guiding function and becomes an object of ego. Jesus warned of this repeatedly, though later texts softened his language. He said, "If the light in you is darkness, how great is that darkness?" He was not speaking of evil, but of distorted light. Knowledge taken without readiness, turning into a trap. When the inner signal is used for self-importance, it reinforces old structures instead of dissolving them. One of the most common mistakes is to treat the sound as a goal, to wait for it, provoke it, monitor it, compare it. Attention then shifts outward again, even if that outward seems internal. The person begins hunting for sensation, and hunting is tension. Tension contracts the system again. The sound either becomes painful or disappears, leaving doubt and frustration. Another danger is interpreting the signal as a command. Something is speaking to me. I am being directed. I must obey. This returns the person to a state of submission. Instead of presence, expectation appears. This is how dependency, fanaticism, and loss of inner discernment arise. Jesus never taught people to follow voices. He taught recognition of state. There is also the opposite extreme, rationalization. The person hears but immediately dismisses. It's just nerves. It means nothing. Here, defense operates subtly. The experience is allowed, but stripped of meaning. The process halts without fear, but without transformation. This, too, is misinterpretation, denial without investigation. The most subtle danger is premature fixation. When a person decides they understand and stops listening. Any living experience evolves. It changes and deepens. But once fixed into an explanation, it stops leading. Jesus called this the leaven of the Pharisees, knowledge that became power instead of path. The correct relationship to the signal is neither belief nor analysis. It is careful presence. Observation without appropriation. Willingness to let the experience remain unclear for as long as necessary. In this state, interpretations fall away on their own, because the body and heart begin to discern without words. This is why Jesus did not give rigid frameworks or complete explanations. He knew, explanation given too early closes the door. Silence leaves it ajar. The sound is not a message, it is a test. Not of intellect, but of perceptual humility. When interpretation is postponed, the signal completes its function and fades, or dissolves into a deeper state. But when interpretation is imposed, the signal becomes either a problem or an idol. And in both cases, contact with what was alive is lost. The danger of misinterpretation is not that something will go wrong, but that nothing will go further. A person remains on the surface, convinced they already understand. And this is precisely the state Jesus called blindness with sight. How to distinguish the call from noise. The most subtle trap on this path is confusing the call with noise, because both arise within. Both may involve sound, but their nature is opposite. Jesus taught discernment not through analysis, but through the quality of the state in which the experience appears. Not what do you hear, but who do you become when you hear it. Noise is always born from tension, even if it is quiet, even if it feels subtle. Its source is anxiety, fear, expectation, the attempt to control or possess experience. Noise pulls attention. It demands reaction. It creates the urge to do something, check, suppress, amplify, explain. After noise, a person feels more contracted, more tired, more fragmented, even if the mind insists that everything is fine. The call moves differently. It does not demand. It does not pull. It does not force action. It is present. You can ignore it, and it does not punish. You can notice it, and it does not seize you. After the call, a person becomes quieter inside. Not necessarily happier, but more gathered, more whole, less scattered. This is the key criterion. The call integrates, noise fragments. Jesus said his sheep know the voice. This was not about recognizing tone or content. It was about recognizing state. The call is never recognized by intellect, but by the body. The body does not tense. The breath does not shorten. The heart does not contract. Even when there is uncertainty, there is no panic. There is space. Noise almost always intensifies when listened to with expectation. It feeds on attention charged with desire. The call, by contrast, becomes subtler when hunted. Because it is not an object. It is not meant to be captured. It is a background orientation, like the North Star. It does not light the path, but it gives direction. There is a rarely mentioned indicator. Noise makes you into someone. Chosen, special, cursed, selected for a mission, targeted by attack. Whether positive or negative, a role appears. The call does the opposite. It dissolves roles. It leaves no title. In the call, it is difficult to maintain an image of self. That is why the ego resists it. Noise is often contradictory. Today it means one thing, tomorrow another. It creates oscillation. The call is consistent. Even if it appears rarely, its quality is immediately recognizable. It does not change direction. It does not argue with itself. It does not bargain. Jesus did not give a technique for distinction. He gave a criterion. By their fruits you will know them. The fruit of noise is fatigue, dependency, and the need for validation. The fruit of the call is simplicity, sobriety, and the gradual dissolution of inner falsehood. Not instantly, but inevitably. It is also important that the call never demands withdrawal from life. It does not pull you away from the world. It returns you to it with greater presence. Noise, on the other hand, often disconnects into fantasy, fear, or obsessive self-monitoring. The call does not make a person spiritual. It makes them real. If you are unsure, do not decide immediately. In Jesus' teaching, waiting was considered a form of wisdom. What is true can withstand a pause. Noise demands immediate response. The call is patient. It may disappear and return without losing meaning. Noise disappears and leaves emptiness. Over time, discernment becomes embodied. Not because one learns, but because tension falls away. When the rush to understand dissolves, the difference becomes obvious, like the difference between a friend's whisper and the background of a street. And if you want a simple criterion, it is this. The call leads towards silence, even if it begins as sound. Noise leads toward more noise, even if it begins quietly. Everything else is secondary. What to do when the frequency increases? The first and most important thing is not to fix anything. An increase in frequency does not mean something has gone wrong. On the contrary, it means the system has stopped suppressing. The most common mistake is immediate intervention, distraction, suppression, explanation, fixation. But in Jesus' teaching, intensification was always understood as a moment of transition, not a problem to eliminate. When frequency increases, the body is testing one thing. Can you remain present without control? So the first step is slowing down, not physically, but internally. Stop chasing the sensation or fleeing from it. Allow it to be without pulling closer or pushing away. Any extreme is resistance. Resistance makes the signal sharp. The second step is breath without technique. Not deep, not correct. Simply allow breathing to return to its natural rhythm. In moments of intensification, breathing often becomes shallow due to subtle tension. When breath softens, the nervous system receives a clear message. There is no threat. The intensity stops escalating. The third step is placing attention in the body, not the head. Do not analyze what this means. Notice where the body feels grounded. Feet, back, weight. This is not grounding as a method, but a return to wholeness. Frequency does not like when a person escapes into interpretation. It intensifies to bring attention back to the body. If you return willingly, it does not need to raise the volume. The fourth step is to abandon the attempt to remember or reproduce the experience. Intensification is temporary. It is not meant to be collected. Any attempt to preserve it turns it into a goal, and a goal reintroduces tension. In Jesus' teaching, do not hold, and it will be given. Frequency follows this principle exactly. It is important to understand that during intensification, old emotions often surface: anxiety, sadness, irritation. This is not a side effect or regression. It is release. Frequency does not only sound, it dislodges what held the body in contraction. There is no need to work with emotions separately. Simply do not resist them and do not draw conclusions about yourself. Another key point is not to seek external validation. Intensification is an intimate process. When a person starts comparing, reading, asking, the center of gravity shifts outward. Then either the intensity drops or confusion arises. Jesus always redirected attention inward because external knowledge at this stage interferes. If intensification happens at night, the best response is not to get up or change the environment. Light, screens, and movement activate defense mode. Remain in dimness and stillness, allowing the body to ride the wave. It always passes. Frequency does not accumulate endlessly. It rises, peaks, and dissolves when not resisted. Over time, a pattern becomes clear. The less you do, the softer the intensification becomes. This contradicts habitual logic, but aligns perfectly with inner reality. Frequency increases when attention is ready. It decreases when integration is complete. It is a self-regulating process. Jesus left no instructions on what to do, because any doing quickly becomes method, and method becomes control. He left a state instead: effortless watchfulness. When you remain in that state, frequency causes no harm and requires no intervention. It completes its function and recedes. So the best response to intensification is presence. Not heroic, not tense. Simple. Being here without fleeing or appropriating. And then what seemed intense becomes clear. What seemed like a problem reveals itself as a stage. Why the Church removed this knowledge? The answer does not lie in belief, but in power. The Church removed this knowledge not because it was false, but because it was uncontrollable. In Jesus' teaching, there was a dangerous element: direct access. Access to the source without an intermediary. And this element posed an existential threat to any institutional system. Jesus did not create a religion in the modern sense. He did not build hierarchy, establish administrative control, or design an apparatus of authority. His message was simple, and therefore destabilizing. The kingdom is within. That meant a human being does not require an external channel to encounter the divine. And if that is true, the intermediary becomes unnecessary. Knowledge of the inner signal, the ringing, the frequency, the resonance, was direct confirmation of this statement. It made truth verifiable through the body, not through belief, not through doctrine, not through promises of the future, but through experience here and now. Such experience cannot be regulated. It cannot be granted by permission. It cannot be monopolized. The early church recognized this quickly, and it chose structural survival over truth. Everything that pointed to human autonomy was either reframed or removed. Direct knowing was replaced with faith, resonance with obedience, inner hearing with correct interpretation of text. What made this knowledge especially dangerous was that it did not rely on moral pressure. It did not function through fear of punishment or hope of reward. It functioned through recognition. And a person who recognizes cannot be governed by threats. They are no longer dependent on the institution to tell them where God is. They hear. So the church made strategic moves. First, bodily signals were declared suspicious. Anything arising internally without sanction was labeled temptation, delusion, or illness. Second, silence was replaced with ritual. Prayer became speech rather than state. Words displaced presence. Third, knowledge was fragmented. Certain sayings of Jesus were preserved but stripped of experiential context. He who has ears, let him hear, became metaphor instead of instruction. The kingdom is within became abstraction instead of direction. The text remained, but the key was lost. The church could not allow the ordinary person to realize that their body is an antenna, that the heart is an organ of perception, that silence is not emptiness, but a channel. Because then, control through fear, guilt, and dependency collapses. And without those mechanisms, the institution cannot sustain itself. It is important to understand, this was not a conspiracy in the simplistic sense. It was systemic logic. Every hierarchy protects itself. Knowledge that makes humans autonomous is always pushed aside. Not because it is evil, but because it undermines the foundation of power. And yet, the knowledge did not disappear. It cannot be fully destroyed because it does not exist only in texts. It is encoded in the body, in the nervous system, in the architecture of perception itself. That is why, centuries later, people continue to encounter the same signal without ever reading a forbidden manuscript. The church could cut words, but not function. It could rename experience, but not cancel resonance. And now this knowledge returns not through books or sermons, but through direct experience, through what cannot be banned. Jesus said that if humans remained silent, the stones would cry out. This was not poetry. It was a statement of inevitability. Truth does not depend on institutions. When the outer path is blocked, the inner one opens. And that is why the knowledge once removed is becoming accessible again, not as doctrine, but as lived experience.